So this leads us to consider the question that you see on the slide here, right? Which what is the goal or purpose of a discussion activity, right? Or in other words, why would an instructor want to use a discussion board activity as opposed to a traditional class assignment? And I bring this up because I know of some professors who want to get rid of discussion boards altogether, or who have gotten rid of discussion boards altogether in their online courses. And I guess I want to stop as we get started with this conversation to reflect on for a moment on like why we do this thing in the first place. I mentioned before that early in my educational career, I was a high school English teacher, taught AP literature, and in a face-to-face setting, I love a good discussion, right? Some of my favorite moments teaching high school were when we would engage a deep and meaningful class conversation or a Socratic seminar about a good book and how it affects us, right? And I also think about this phenomenon from having taken part in a great book club, right? An engaging conversation with other people about something that we're reading together. That there's this dynamic that can happen where we talk out our understanding about something that can help me as a student, and at times even help me as a teacher to process what I think about something and why I think it, right? And you might be familiar with the term that we refer to as social constructivism, right? Social constructivism teaches that knowledge develops as a result of social interaction, right? It's a shared rather than an individual experience. And if you take away the social interaction and social constructivist learning from an online course, that sometimes what you're left with is something that feels like a MOOC, right? A massive open online course, right? And if you've ever taken a MOOC before, you may know that there's a decent amount of isolation for students in these learning environments, right? And it's a scenario where I'm sort of left here out on the silo, out on my own, left to digest content on my own. And so the two reasons why I mentioned here about the purpose of these discussions is that it supports social constructivist learning, and it also combats the tendency towards isolation that can often occur in an online environment. And before I move on here, I want to just take a moment and draw some parallels between a discussion board and a face-to-face discussion, since the goals are predominantly the same, right? So coming back to this example earlier on, right? When I was a high school English teacher and I worked on trying to get the momentum started around a class discussion, there were definitely moments when questions landed with crickets chirping, right? And other moments where as soon as the question is out of my mouth, the students have taken the conversation and run with it, right? That there's 20 hands in the air from students who want to chime in. And for me, in those moments, if I notice that the discussion is flat and that it's not going anywhere, it's more often than not, it's a product of the questions that I'm asking. And not that students are just lazy or something. And then, now I know, and we talked about this early on, there's something to be said about the dynamics that occur, or sort of sometimes you have a group that's just a quiet group, right? Which does happen. But in general, I would say that for most of the time, if I notice that like I keep asking a question with different class periods and I see it's not going anywhere, I want to look at what do I notice about the questions that I'm asking in this context, right? Am I asking questions that are likely to sustain conversation and prompt student interest? And is it likely to just give us something to talk about, right? So for example, if I think about high school English questions, if I ask a question like, summarize what you read in chapter 2 of the book 1984, it's not likely to lead us to having something substantive to talk about. Like as soon as someone says the answer, it's out there and it's like, what more is there to say? He just answered your question, right? However, a question that might be much more likely to lead to a meaty discussion might be something like George Orwell in 1984 and Aldous Huxley in A Brave New World offer different versions of a dystopian future. Whose dystopia is more likely to happen in America today? A question like that is much more likely to lead to like, well, let's talk about this. Let's unpack it. Let's talk about your perspective and how you would respond to that question, right? And so that sort of gets at what, sorry, there, I'm behind. I need to make sure I'm following my slide. There's our two reasons why we want to use a discussion activity as opposed to a traditional class discussion, right? So I want to take a few moments to consider the details from an interesting study. The researchers of this study investigated the relationship between the types of discussion prompts that were used in an online discussion and the depth of critical thinking that each prompt was able to develop from the students who were participating in the course. And so this is the full list of the types of prompt structures that they were looking at in this study. And I actually found this list to be kind of rather insightful. I'm not going to read this full list here, but I did want to look at a few of them together just to give a sense of the content that's here. But to just look at one example here, the playground prompt. The description of a playground prompt is questions that require the interpretation or analysis of a specific aspect of the material, or playground for discussion. And the key here is the specific aspect of the material. And then students are free to discover and interpret the material. So here's an example. But to read it together, it says, in the first paragraph of the web article, Attributes of Good Listening, the author states that you cannot be a good leader unless you're a good listener. In 1 to 2 paragraphs, explain in your own words what the author means by this. How are the two, listening and good leader, related? Do you agree or disagree? Explain your reasoning, right? So again, this idea of a playground prompt involves students being free to interpret one specific aspect of the material. And in this in this example, it's not focusing on the content as a whole, but just on the specific quote from the reading about being a good listener, right? And so this would be what's entailed in a playground prompt. If we look at another example, brainstorming prompt. This would be questions where students are questions that ask students to generate a number of conceivable ideas, viewpoints, or solutions related to a specific issue. And they're free to generate any or all ideas on the topic. Obviously, you know what brainstorming is. It's a question that asks students, or a prompt that asks students to brainstorm the topic. You can see an example here of a brainstorm prompt. Families of children with hearing loss often turn to the internet for information regarding hearing loss, intervention practices, and communication modalities. And then they discuss the potential benefits and dangers of relying on internet information for parents. So their students in this would be brainstorming, coming up, generating a list of potential benefits and dangers of internet information for parents, right? In this prompt, brainstorming comes in as students are coming up with that list. They can't go to their textbook to find the answer. They're generating these ideas themselves. And then one final example, like I said, I don't want to read this whole thing, just sort of looking at what's in this handout that I'm giving you. One final example here is a focal prompt, where this says questions relate to a specific issue, require students to make a decision or take a position and justify it. Students are asked to support one of several possible positions. And this one might also be referred to as a debate prompt. An example, it says, if you recall back to the first chapter in 4 book and her story about Gerald's Tired, she talks about Gerald's employees taking a personality test, Myers-Briggs test. Do you think this would be beneficial when hiring new employees where you work? Use a discussion board to debate your perspective. So ideally, what's going to result from this prompt is that students take a position, right, on whether they think the Myers-Briggs would be beneficial for hiring new employees. Just on a side note here, I was actually asked to take a personality test when I was applying for a job back in college. It's just, I think I was like, it was waiting tables at like maybe a Chili's or something like that. The manager took my completed personality test while I was there for an interview, and he came back 10 minutes later and he was like, unfortunately, we're not able to hire you. Maybe this is in my memory. He said, like, you didn't pass the test. I was like, what do you mean I didn't pass the test? It's a personality test. It's like, I'm sorry, I like you a lot, but corporate won't let us hire anyone who doesn't pass the test. So I'm ready for this discussion, right? If I'm a student in this particular class. But a debate prompt, or sometimes referred to as a focal prompt, would be another example. So my reason in putting this out here, what does this study demonstrate? So this begs a question, like, why are you studying? Why are you sharing this study with us? What is the point? And part of what we learned from this study is that it matters what your goals are when you choose a particular prompt type or prompt style to use in your discussion. So, for example, if the goal of your online discussion is to facilitate higher levels of critical thinking, and actually on the next slide, it actually is going to identify which of the prompts on that list is the best one at facilitating higher levels of critical thinking. So what this study suggests is that if your goal is to facilitate higher levels of critical thinking, that the critical incident question types work the best. We didn't look at this one in depth before. This is not one of the like few that we read together, but it's the one that's at the bottom of the list. But this is the case study prompt, where the prompt presents a scenario or case study. Students are asked to propose a solution to the issues presented in the scenario or case study. So if your goal is critical thinking, the research suggests this is the best at doing that. So what the study suggested is, if the goal of the discussion is to exchange ideas, they suggest that focal prompts work the best. You may remember this is also the one that's like the debate prompt, where they're taking a position and justifying it. They also mentioned that repeatedly what they found is that certain prompts were not good at generating higher order thinking. The lower level, the prompts that were sort of only able of producing lower levels of thinking were I'll just go ahead and jump into these two rather than pausing for this one, but were the brainstorm and general invitation questions. The brainstorm prompt is one that we talked about earlier, right? Where they're just sort of coming up with, generating ideas, coming up with a list of ideas like you would suggest in brainstorming. General invitation is one that involves inviting a wide range of responses within a broad topic in an open or unfocused discussion. This was how the description is read on this on the handout. So this might include a prompt like, tell me what stood out to you most from the textbook reading or the module videos this week, where it's just sort of like a, you tell me what was important, or you tell me what you found striking or interesting. Those types of prompts are not likely to lead to higher order thinking, depth of thought, right? So now what? Okay, so we looked at this study, we looked at what it tells us. So now what? Well, I want to see if we can pinpoint some takeaways from this study, and from a few others, and connect it to our workshop objective related to discerning and writing good discussion prompts, discussion questions. So I want to start by sort of start that challenge or that objective with throwing out this question. What makes a good discussion question? Or what do we know about what makes a good discussion question? So let's see if we can hone in on a few qualities. So the first thing that I would point out about what makes a good discussion question is that it's connected to the intended purpose and learning objectives to be achieved, as in Bloom's taxonomy, right? And this connects us with a point we made earlier about the results of this study, right? As you think about crafting your own prompts, or maybe you're thinking about revising your own prompts, you want to consider what the objectives are for your course and for the module where this discussion is found, right? Is the objective related to cultivating deep levels of critical thinking and analysis? And if that's the case, maybe a critical incident or the case study prompt is most appropriate for you. Is the objective more related to the exchange of ideas at this point in your course? Maybe that's where a focal or debate prompt would work the best. And if you've ever worked at length with an instructional designer before, if you've taken our TOL course, this is probably something you've heard right before, that we want to encourage taking your learning objectives into consideration in whatever you're doing, but explicitly and poignantly here in this example, it matters what my objectives are before I actually think about, okay, what is the prompt that I'm going to ask students to be doing in this discussion board. A second point here is it will push students to deepen their thinking and understanding by engaging in the discussion. And there's two parts to this point. First part is that it pushes students to deepen their thinking and understanding. And the second part is that it generates engagement in the discussion. And I just think it's worth mentioning here that there are good questions that can help trigger reflection, but it's not good at generating discussion. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's probably just best left to your more traditional assignments, not to a discussion board, right? There's not an official rule that says every module, every week, I have to have one traditional assignment and one discussion board, right? If that's something that you like, that's fine, but it's not a rule. And just because I have a question that's good, that's going to generate some reflection, it doesn't mean it's a question that's going to lead to discussion, right? So in the handout that I gave you, those question types, that Google Doc, analytic convergent questions would be a good example of this, right? This is the definition of these questions are ones that require analytic thought, but they lead to a single correct answer. Those would be best left to a traditional assignment. I don't want to make a discussion board out of an analytic convergent questions, because that's one where it's like, as soon as the question's out there, everybody else is just like, I agree, he said it, there's nothing left to say, right? So then the final point here about what makes a good discussion question is it promotes divergent rather than convergent thinking. And this is a really important point that I hope that you take away from this training, right? Divergent rather than convergent. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in just a moment, what this means, and unpack this in greater detail. But for now, I want to delineate this delineate these two terms by saying convergent is where I'm looking for students to converge on the right answer. And divergent prompts are those that encourage differences of opinion and differences of perspective, right? So good discussion questions are those that promote divergent rather than convergent thinking. Come on. So poorly designed questions are those that just are asking for a regurgitation of information or that are limiting creative thinking. Right, and an example that I would add here, right? Summarize the key points from the reading about the argument for each side of the media methods debate. Cite specific references to the text and respond to at least two of your peers. This question is really just asking students to kind of regurgitate or put in their own words information that they encountered in the module for the week, right? And this might make for a good assignment or a journal entry for students to complete. But again, once someone has hit the main points about, the key points from each side of the argument, what is there for us to talk about, right? Then that's an example where my response becomes, I second what John said, right? He said it perfectly, right? So well-designed questions are those that are going to encourage exploration, that are going to generate discussion and lead to new insights. So if we think about kind of the exact same subject matter from the last question, right, where students are reading about both sides of the media methods debate. An example of a better prompt would be, after reading this week about the media methods debate, which side's argument do you find more compelling? Respond to at least 2 of your peers, and one response should be to a person who found the other side more compelling, right? So this would be more on the debate prompt or the focal prompt side, where we're debating 2 sides of this, where I think this side's better, you think that side's better. You know, in an example like this, maybe in this week's reading for the course, we had students read about the 2 sides of this debate. But students may not have a fully formed understanding of the argument until they've had an opportunity to work out their thinking on it, right? To defend an argument, to poke holes in someone who is defending the other side. This is like good social constructivist learning. Knowledge develops as a result of social interaction, right? It's a shared rather than an individual experience. So let's sort of maybe conceptualize this in a different way, thinking about convergent versus divergent point, coming back to this element again. On the convergent side, these are questions that are often written at the lower order level. They're questions that has one correct or best answer. I keep coming back to my experience, but again, when I was a high school English teacher, I would often do just simple Google searches, right, to find discussions for the books that we were reading in order to prep for a face-to-face discussion. So I'd be like, I want to have some good questions in my arsenal, and I would do a quick Google search. What questions can I find? And there are some really bad questions out there that I can pretty much guarantee are not going to lead to good conversation that I would encounter in those searches. And I offer as an example questions that I found at one point when I was teaching the book Of Mice and Men. I don't know if you remember this book, kind of a traditional high school English read. But these were questions that I found that were out there. It's like, hey, here's some recommended discussion questions for Of Mice and Men. Questions like, what kind act does Slim do for Lenny? Even if you don't remember the answer to that question, there's a single answer to that question. Describe George and Lenny's dream. Again, there's a single answer to that question. Or another one. What is Carlson's solution to the problem of Candy's dog? Right? These are not discussion questions. Right? His solution is you take him out back and shoot him, put him out of his misery. Like, once I've said that answer, it's out there. There's nothing left to say. These are convergent comprehension questions. Right? So then, divergent questions are those that elicit higher order or differing responses. They promote deep thinking. They lead students to analyze and evaluate alternative answers. If we come back to our example of Mice and Men, questions that would generate divergent responses that are more likely to lead to good conversation might include a question like, was George's act to kill his friend morally justified? Why or why not? Right? That students are not going to come to the same answer here, and that's okay, right? But it's more about how the conversation ensues in response to that. Here's some additional examples of convergent and divergent questions. These are more kind of generic convergent and divergent questions. So on the convergent side, what is the common theme in this text? What happened as a result of those actions? What were the long-term consequences of this action? What was the reason why this happened? And again, like we keep saying, with each of these questions, there's really only one correct answer. Once it's out there, there's not much to talk about. No room for differences of perspective or differences of opinion. On the divergent side, what different strategies could be used to solve this problem? What's another way of looking at this? And this one's maybe a little bit more specific context, but what would the world be like if the UK had voted to remain in the European Union? Or how will COVID-19 change how we work in the future? Again, in each of these questions, it encourages students to analyze and evaluate alternative answers. Right? I will likely be better off by hearing what you have to say on this question, even if I like my answer better, that I'll be better off by hearing your perspective, hearing your opinion. So, all right, I want to take a moment and hone in on a takeaway from this information. So, like, you know, if you think about what I want you to be left with at the end of this conversation, based on everything that we've learned from that initial study that we looked at, and these additional points about what constitutes well-designed questions and considering the promotion of divergent rather than convergent thinking, I might suggest having a sort of top 3 discussion prompts, right? And sort of think of this as like tools to keep in your tool belt, right? And that each of these have been shown to promote deep learning and critical thinking. And often I find myself as an instructor of my own courses coming back to, like, if I'm thinking about, hey, I know I don't have anything formulated yet, or I want to revise a discussion prompt, this is sort of my go-to big 3 that I will think about. Would one of these make sense to include at this point in the course, right? These promote divergent thinking, good to encourage discussion and conversation. So I want to briefly revisit each of these one more time as we look to add it as sort of an effective tool in our tool belt when crafting discussion prompts. So again, the focal or debate prompt requires students to take a position, make a decision, and justify it as they're asked to support one side of several possible positions. So here's one more example of a debate focal prompt, right? After digesting the video and readings on the CRISPR technology, decide whether you think it's ethically appropriate for scientists to genetically edit babies. Respond to at least 2 of your peers. One response should be to a person who disagrees with your position. So this is one tool in your tool belt, the debate prompt. Is there something in the content of your module that would facilitate a good, healthy debate? All right. The second, the case study or critical incident prompt. This is where we present a scenario or case study, and students are asked to propose solutions to the issues that are presented in the scenarios or case studies. So the example that we're providing here, after reading the attached case study describing the scenario experienced by Mrs. Jones and her student, what steps would you take to address the problem if you were the teacher? Be specific about what you would do first, second, third, and what considerations you would factor into your decision. So obviously, examples like this would include, I would have to have an additional document, like describing the scenario. Perhaps it's a description of the teacher who's dealing with the classroom management struggles, and then it describes the behaviors of a particular student in the class. In examples like this, you as the instructor could either try to find existing scenarios and case studies, or create your own based on your understanding of problems of practice that exist in your field. Right, so that's our second tool in our tool belt. And then finally, the third one that I encourage as a tool in your tool belt is the problem-based prompt. This typically focuses on a problem that is related to the content area and asks students to discuss the formulation of solutions. We didn't look at this one before. It's on that handout that I gave you. But this is basically just an example of problem. This is just an example of a problem-based prompt where students are asked to formulate and discuss solutions to problems in their content area. So this particular example says, in this forum, post your experiences with educational reforms that failed. In your post, try to really analyze why. Why did this reform work fail? What conditions were in place to make it not sustainable? Who led the reform? What actions did they take? What should or could the leadership have done differently? So again, it's focusing on a problem and asking students to formulate potential solutions to that problem. That's the third tool that I'm encouraging you to sort of have in your tool belt. So again, here's our main three that we've looked at. You're sort of thinking about everything that we've talked about here, about what the research suggests works to generate deep learning and good conversation. Right? It's the debate prompt, the case study prompt, and the problem-based prompt.